I'm gonna show you how great I am.
This was our tiny tower.
I just want to say from the bottom of my heart, I'd like to take this chance to apologize to absolutely nobody.
Hello, and welcome to How to Take Over the World. This is Ben Wilson. Today, we are talking about Niccolo Machiavelli, the Italian statesman, philosopher, and writer, best known for his book, The Prince. Machiavelli is not known as someone who took over the world himself. He did hold office in the Republican government of his native city of Florence, but the real reason to study him is not for what he did, but for what he wrote. His book, The Prince, is one of the most famous books of all time. For hundreds of years, it has given rulers a playbook for seizing and maintaining power. So, of course, I would want to study him on this podcast. The show is called How to Take Over the World. He basically wrote a handbook on exactly that, on taking over the world. Of course, there is a dark side to Machiavelli's reputation. He is known as someone who was ruthless, dishonest, violent, bent on the pursuit of power at any cost. And that reputation is not completely unearned. So, for example, we read in The Prince, to possess them, he's talking about your territories, securely, it is sufficient only to have wiped out the family line of the prince who ruled them, because so far as other things are concerned, men live peacefully as long as their old way of life is maintained, and there is no change in customs. Okay, so he speaks very casually about wiping out an entire family line. Presumably that includes children as well, right? Or another quote from the prince. One must understand this. A prince, and especially a new prince, cannot observe all those things for which men are considered good, because in order to maintain the state, he must often act against his faith, against charity, against humanity, and against religion. And so it is necessary that he should have a mind ready to turn itself according to the way of the winds of fortune, and the changing circumstances command him. And here's the truth about Machiavelli. He doesn't care about right or wrong, at least not in the context of what he's talking about in The Prince and his other writings. It's like asking a biologist to constantly make references to whether a lion is right or wrong when it takes down a gazelle. They're just studying how a lion hunts, what it eats. They're just not thinking about whether it's right or wrong. And similarly, Machiavelli is considered by many the first modern political scientist. And so he's just studying politics as a science. He's not making references to what you should do, at least not in The Prince. He's just telling you, what people do, how things actually operate in the real world. And it turns out, like the law of the jungle, the world of politics is dirty, it's violent, it's cruel. And in his book, Discourses on Livy, that's his second most famous book probably, he actually does talk quite a bit about what kind of state he would like to see exist in the world. And what he wants to see are more representative republics that take the Roman system as a model. And so that doesn't sound that bad, right? So it's not like he's an all evil guy. It's just he's studying this science completely objectively. Anyway, Machiavelli himself is a remarkable person. I loved studying him. He's a great writer. He's incredibly insightful. He's funny. He's perceptive. And at times, he's breathtakingly honest. It's very refreshing to read his writing. And there's a reason that his works have stood the test of time and been used as handbooks by great rulers across centuries. So let's see what his playbook was for taking over the world. This is the life of Niccolo Machiavelli. If you want to take over the world, it helps to look the part. And so you, my dear listener, need to be in the gym. You need to be working out. And there's only one supplement that I have taken that has actually helped me to put on muscle, and it's creatine. It really, really works. It's one of the most tested supplements in the world. And I recommend instantized creatine from Gains in Bulk. It's the only creatine that is fully water soluble. So it completely dissolves in water and it gives you the results of muscle endurance, strength, and size without the bloating and water retention that you can get from some other creatines. So use the link in the show notes and use code BEN to get a discount and support the show. I drink it every day. Try it out. You won't regret it. That is creatine from Gains in Bulk. Okay, so to understand Machiavelli, we have to understand a little bit about his life and where he's coming from. So Machiavelli is born in Renaissance Italy in Florence to a family of pretty humble origins. They're not like poor, they're not literally peasantry, but considering their class, which is, the noble classes, the Machiavellis don't come from super wealthy circumstances. You can see this in his education. He learns Italian and Latin, but he never learns ancient Greek, which is surprising for someone who ends up having such a scholarly influence on the world. Renaissance Florence was a chaotic place. Internally, it bounced back and forth between, on the one hand, republican governments where all the noble families shared power and elected the magistrates, and then on the other hand, rule by the powerful Medici family. And it was sort of a monarchical arrangement under the Medicis. They would still keep up the pretense of a republican government under the Medicis, but this is essentially just a fig leaf to barely conceal the true nature of their rule over the city. Florence was a financial center in Italy. It was quite wealthy, and as such, it dominated many of the smaller city-states in its region of Tuscany in Italy. Florence had a republican government when Machiavelli was born, but it was Medici-dominated for most of his childhood and young adulthood. Zooming out to the global picture, the picture was also chaotic there. There was no cohesive Italy, and it was constantly the plaything of larger powers, especially the French, the Spanish, the Germans through the Holy Roman Empire, and the papacy, the Pope, the Catholic Church. And so these different powers are constantly invading, seizing territory, extracting payments, setting up puppet governments, and otherwise just wreaking havoc on Italy. Florence was an important power in Italy, but not strong enough to be truly independent, certainly not strong enough to stand up to any of the powers that we've just discussed. And so they mostly aligned themselves with the French to provide them with stability and military backing. That was especially true when they had republican governments. Now, we know basically nothing about Machiavelli's early life. It wouldn't be Machiavelli if we didn't have some intrigue and some mystery, right? We do know what he looked like. We have some portraits, and this is a good description from a biography I read by Ridolfi, is the author's name. He says, in his person, he was well proportioned, of middle height, thin, erect, and bold in his bearing. His hair was black, his skin pale, but slightly sallow. His head was small with bony features and a high forehead. His eyes shone very bright, and his thin, compressed lips seemed always to bear an ironical smile. Okay, so that's what he looks like. Again, we know nothing really about his childhood. And then when he is 29 years old, so we know basically nothing until he's 29, but when he's 29, the Medicis are overthrown and a new republican government is installed, and he is elected to one of the top positions. One biographer jokes that, quote, at the age of 29, so totally unknown that up to then there is not the slightest trace or mention of him either in chronicles or in private republic documents, Machiavelli issued forth like a figure in a myth, fully grown and armed from the bosom of his people. Okay, so 29 years, nothing, and then all of a sudden, he's a very important figure in Florence. We assume that, sometime in the previous 29 years, he must have been active in Republican intellectual circles and must have had some powerful patron. But again, this being Machiavelli, we can only guess at who that patron might have been. The great project of the Florentine state at that time was to conquer the nearby city-state of Pisa. And so they've been trying to do this for a number of years. Florence mostly doesn't have an army, so that's making it difficult. So they use a combination of assistance from the French, who, as you'll remember, they're aligned with, and then mostly mercenaries. And so just after Machiavelli comes to power, they are once again attacking Pisa and trying to take it over. And he actually goes and he is one of the people who oversees this operation. And so he's overseeing all of these mercenaries, and they've got these big cannons and they blow apart the walls of Pisa. And so it should be really easy to go in. The problem is, once the walls are down, the first men through the walls are probably going to die, right? The defenders are going to be right there behind the walls. And yeah, at that point, it's easy to take over Pisa, but some people are going to have to die in actually going through the walls and now taking it over. But these guys are mercenaries, and they don't really care. Like, they're not going to die for Florence. They don't care about Florence. They're not Florentine. These are guys just getting a paycheck. And so they say no. When it comes time to actually take over Pisa, they say no. And they actually say, actually, now that we think about it, you haven't paid us everything that we think we're owed, and so we're not going to do it. And in fact, we're going to take some of these people like Machiavelli hostage who are overseeing us from Florence. Machiavelli himself doesn't get taken hostage, but a couple guys that he's associated with do. And the Florentines have to buy them off, pay a ransom to get these guys back, and then the mercenaries leave, and Pisa is never taken. It's like they hired Walmart to take over the city, and at first they're very professional. They're like, yeah, job to do, we'll do it. But then when it comes time to die for this cause, they're like, no, we're just Walmart. We're just some employees. What do you think we're going to die for this? No way. And so the invasion of Pisa just totally falls apart. This is a traumatizing event for Machiavelli. He hated, probably before then, but especially since then, he hated mercenaries. He hated to deal with them. He hated that Florence had to rely on them. And so in his writings, he would always advocate for strength of arms for any prince, that they would actually have their own army that they could control. So as a high-ranking official for Florence, he's then sent to the French to complain about this and say, hey, your guys were here with these mercenaries and they didn't do anything to help us take over Pisa when you said they would. And the French basically blow him off. They're like, yeah, that sounds like a you problem. So you figure it out. And that is basically Machiavelli's life for the next 14 years. He's in high-stakes negotiations with often the French, sometimes with the papacy, sometimes with other city-states in Italy, and often with mercenaries. Because it wasn't just as simple as hiring them. Like if there was a war between Florence and, let's say, Bologna or Siena, then you would go out and try and hire these mercenaries, but the other guys are trying to hire the mercenaries too, right? And the mercenaries, money's part of it, the highest bidder, but it's also part, who do we think is going to win? Do we think you're actually going to be able to come through on the payments? All this stuff. And so he's in these negotiations with all these other powers and all these mercenaries for the next 14 years of his life. Most famously, he's an ambassador to a warlord named Cesare Borgia. And Borgia is this really interesting, colorful figure. He is extremely Machiavellian, both in the way he acts, and we think of Machiavellian as meaning deceitful, power hungry, all this stuff, but also, Machiavelli advised him. Machiavelli often writes about him in The Prince, so he's strongly associated with Machiavelli. So this guy, Cesare Borgia, his father was the Pope. And so, it's a different time. And so the Pope is giving him the backing of the church to carve out his own little kingdom in central Italy. Borgia doesn't actually conquer the Florentines, but he intimidates them, forces them to back him and supply him with money, with tribute. And so Machiavelli is sent to be an ambassador to Cesare Borgia, and they quickly strike up a friendship, and Machiavelli acts as an informal advisor and a sounding board for Borgia. And by the way, the other notable person that the Florentines send to Borgia is Leonardo da Vinci, who acts as an advisor in military engineering projects. And so da Vinci and Machiavelli strike up a friendship. It's impossible to say how close they actually become, but we have some letters between the two of them after this time in which Machiavelli helps da Vinci transact some business, so they did at least maintain some sort of relationship going forward. And so I have to believe that at least on some level, they recognized the genius in one another. And this is one of these times in history that I just would love to be a fly on the wall, to hear Borgia and Machiavelli and da Vinci talking. What did they talk about? Three of the greatest minds of their generation all together. It's very intriguing to me. So Borgia is used as an example quite often in The Prince, and mostly in a positive way. For example, Machiavelli writes, quote, "He did everything and used every method that a prudent and virtuous man ought to employ in order to root himself securely in those states that the arms and fortune of others had granted him. If therefore we consider all the Duke's achievements, we shall see that he laid sturdy foundations for his future power." Okay, so he has good things to say about Cesare Borgia. So what was this guy like that Machiavelli respected him so much? You wouldn't call him the best guy, right? In one famous incident, there are some mercenary leaders who plot against him. The plot is uncovered, and Borgia says, "Look, I get it. You thought you could get one over on me, but you didn't. I forgive you. Let's reconcile." So he says he wants to reconcile with them. He invites them to dinner, and then once they come to dinner with him, he has them all seized and strangled to death. He also famously has a lieutenant named Ramiro de Orco, and he has de Orco pacify the region of Romagna. And so under Borgia's direction, de Orco mercilessly, he tortures people, he extracts a ton of wealth, he heavily taxes them, he massacres people, he just totally represses the local inhabitants who might object to Borgia's rule. It's completely ruthless, but it's very effective. Completely pacifies Romagna. However, now they've got a problem, which is, the people are pacified, but they hate these guys. And so once de Orco is done doing only the things that Borgia has told him to do, Borgia comes around and says, "Whoa, this guy's been acting like a tyrant. I can't believe that he would treat you people like this. I can't believe the stuff he's been doing." And so he has de Orco seized and executed, his head displayed on a pike. Okay. So this is completely deceitful, right? And you would call it wrong. You'd probably call it wrong. And this is exactly the kind of ruler that we think of when we say Machiavellian. And clearly, what we think of as Machiavellian, I said at the beginning, maybe we have a wrong impression of Machiavelli, but at least somewhat it's rooted in fact, right? Because Machiavelli personally liked Borgia, advised him, and praised him in writing, and this is the kind of stuff that he's doing. So that's 2 years he's with Cesare Borgia, but that's not his primary aim, is not to promote Borgia. His primary aim is to promote Florence. So after he leaves Borgia's court, he goes back to Florence, where he continues to serve in the government. His biggest, splashiest, most notable accomplishment is to establish a local Florentine army, a militia. Like I said, he hated mercenaries. And so with this homegrown army, he does what mercenaries were not able to do. He conquers Pisa. They kind of go through the same thing once again. They go back, they bring some cannons, they knock down the walls of Pisa. But this time, with the soldiers of Florence doing it for, the glory of their city, they charge in and they take Pisa. And this is the zenith of Machiavelli's public career. He's on top of the world. His quest to have a native Florentine army, when he proposes it, it seems odd. It seems quixotic. It was unexpected. Hiring mercenaries is just what you did in Renaissance Italy. Many people were very skeptical of this initiative. But then by accomplishing what mercenaries could not with this conquest, it was a complete vindication for Machiavelli. Like when he proposed it, everyone's like, you're crazy. He somehow gets it through anyways, and it totally pays off. When it pays off, when they take Pisa, listen to what his friends wrote to him. Agostino Vespucci, and by the way, this is the cousin of Amerigo Vespucci, the Florentine sailor who mapped the New World, and the man after whom America is named. Amerigo Vespucci, America. Okay. So Machiavelli's friend, Agostino Vespucci, writes it to him in a letter. He says, "Congratulations on having been present on such a glorious occasion and having had no small part in the affair. I would make bold to say that you, with your battalions, have produced so fine an institution that not slowly but rapidly you have restored the dominion of Florence. I do not know what to say. I swear to God, we are so happy that I could write a Ciceronian oration for you." Okay, another friend, this guy's name is Filippo de Casavecchia, writes, quote, "1,000 congratulations on the great acquisition of this noble city, for it may be truly said to have been your work, or at any rate the greater part of it. I do not think that your philosophy can ever be understood by stupid people, and there are not enough of the clever ones. You understand me. Every day I see more clearly that you are the greatest prophet the Jews or any other people ever had. Niccolo, truly I tell you that I cannot express all that I would like to." And yet, within just 2 years, he would find himself out of power, robbed of his reputation and his fortune, imprisoned, and even publicly tortured. Before we get to that, I want to take a minute to tell you about Van Man. This is a brand I'm personally obsessed with. They make lotion, tooth powder, mouthwash, chapstick, stuff like that, and they use all natural everything, totally all natural. For example, their lotion, which I use all the time, is made with beef tallow, honey, and olive oil. I use their lotion, their chapstick, and their coconut magnesium deodorant. It's great stuff. It works better than the alternatives, which are, by the way, toxic. So your skin will feel like magic, and it's nice to know that you aren't being poisoned by endocrine disruptors or microplastics or anything like that. I love it. You'll love it. Go to vanman.shop and use code TAKEOVER for 10% off. Everything you put on your skin ends up in your bloodstream. Countless studies have shown that. So don't poison yourself with garbage from these big brands. Try Van Man. You'll thank me later. Okay, so what happens to Machiavelli? Well, Pope Alexander VI, he's the Borgia. He's Cesare Borgia's dad. And he's the one who is supporting and bankrolling his son. And so he dies. Borgia fails because of this. He can't get one of his guys elected pope. He tries to make a deal with a man who has been his enemy. And this pope, his name is Julius II, immediately reneges on the deal, and everything falls apart for Borgia. He's seized, imprisoned, his land's confiscated. He escapes. He actually starts seizing new territory. Just what a guy. He lived this very adventurous life, but he is ultimately killed. So anyway, this new pope, who's not aligned with Borgia, he's also not aligned with the Republican regime in Florence. And so he brings back the Medicis. And the Medicis, they still maintain this outward appearance of a republic. And at first, Machiavelli is even hopeful that he might retain some kind of appointment. But that doesn't come through. And then even worse, there's a conspiracy to kill some of the Medici, overthrow them, restore the Republican government. But it's this very half-baked plan that never gets very far. But stupidly, the conspirators write down a list of people who they think oppose the Medici and who might support them in this conspiracy. They only approach 2 of the 8 people on that list, and those 2 people reject the idea. They're like, "It was a bad idea. Don't do it." However, they're still caught, and the list is turned over to the authorities, and the 7th of the 8 names on the list is Niccolo Machiavelli. So he's thrown in prison, he's interrogated, and he's tortured. The popular form of torture in Florence at the time was to set up this really large structure, so you can think it's kind of like a gallows. Think like you've got these big wooden triangles on 2 sides with a big wooden beam suspended 30 feet in the air. And they throw a rope over it, and then they tie a man's hands behind his back and hoist him up. So he's hanging 30 feet in the air, suspended by his hands behind his back. And then to make the torture worse, sometimes they'll drop them. So they'll suddenly drop it, and then you drop like 10, 15 feet, and then boom, yanks. So this kind of thing, it usually dislocates your shoulders. And then in really bad cases, it can actually like give you paralysis in your arms because of all the nerve damage. You can't use your arms after that. I know it doesn't sound that bad, maybe, like compared to having like bamboo shoved underneath your fingernails, having your arms tied behind your back. But if you actually like do it, you know, just like put your arms behind your back, you realize it's a really uncomfortable position, and especially to get dropped like that. And it's just going to be, torturous. It's a form of torture. It's horrible. So this happens to Machiavelli. He says that he is dropped 6 times. Here's what he writes about it. Quote, "And as for meeting fortune courageously," this is in a letter, "as for meeting fortune courageously, I want you to have this pleasure for my sufferings, to know that I bore them so well that I am pleased with myself and feel that I am a better man than I thought." Okay, so I don't know. It sucks, but it tells you something about Machiavelli, that he says he bears them better than he thought he would. Presumably he means he doesn't rat out anyone else or give any other names. Like, he just takes the torture and keeps his mouth shut. After this torture, he doesn't give any names. He doesn't confess to anything. And so they say, okay, this is like kind of wild, right? They say, okay, it appears that you're genuinely not guilty of anything other than vaguely being opposed to us and having people think that you would rebel against us. So he gets put under loose house arrest. He's basically free to come and go as he pleases, but he can't leave the territory of Florence. And he's also fined a pretty hefty fine, which leaves him pretty impoverished. So he has to retreat to a poorly maintained small estate in the countryside and bide his time while he waits to see if he can come up with some sort of appointment. I mean, really crazy times. These people, they torture him. You know, they hang him by his hands and drop him 6 times. And yet, immediately after, he's like, maybe at some point I can get back in the government. And so he thinks, these people clearly don't like me. They torture me. So I need to do something big, something extravagant, give them something to make them respect me and see that I actually, even though I'm a Republican, I have good ideas, I'm smart, and I have something that I have a lot of knowledge that I can use in their government. And so he comes up with the idea of writing a book, a summary of all the wisdom that he had attained both by experience and through his studies in history. And he calls it The Prince. In Latin, it's called De Principatibus. And I think his writing process is really interesting. It shows the boredom of his day-to-day life and the thrill that he has of engaging with some of the greatest men in world history. So here's what he writes. This is like one of the greatest letters ever written, frankly. So he's writing to his friend. He says, "I rise in the morning with the sun, and I go off to a wood of mine, which I am having cut down, where I stop for 2 hours to see what was done the day before and talk to the woodcutters, who always have some trouble on hand, either among themselves or with the neighbors. Leaving the wood, I go to a spring and thence to some bird traps of mine. I have a book with me, Dante or Petrarch or one of the minor poets, Tibullus, Ovid, or the like. I read about their amorous passions and their loves. I remember my own and dwell enjoyably on these thoughts for a while. Then I go on to the road and into the tavern. I talk to the passerby. I ask what news of their villages. I hear all sorts of things and observe the various tastes and ideas of men. In the meanwhile, it is time for dinner. And with my folk, I eat what food this poor farm and miserable patrimony of mine provides. When I have eaten, I go back to the tavern. Here I find the host, and usually a butcher, a miller, and a couple of kiln men. With them, I degrade myself, playing all day at cricka and trick track. Those are card games. Okay, so he's playing cards. And this gives rise to 1,000 arguments and endless vexations with insulting words. And most times, there's a fight over a penny, and we can be heard shouting from as far away as San Casciano. And so, surrounded by these lice, I blow the cobwebs out of my brain and relieve the unkindness of my fate, content that she trample on me in this way to see if she is not ashamed to treat me thus. When evening comes, I return home and go into my study, and at the door, I take off daytime dress covered in mud and dirt and put on royal and curial robes. And then, decently attired, I enter the courts of the ancients, where affectionately greeted by them, I partake of that food which is mine alone and for which I was born, where I am not ashamed to talk with them and inquire the reasons of their actions. And they, out of their human kindness, answer me. And for 4 hours at a stretch, I feel no worry of any kind. I forget all my troubles. I am not afraid of poverty or of death. I give myself up entirely to them. Okay. I mean, that's just amazing. So he's making fun of himself a little bit, right? Like, look, I got all these petty trifles. I go talk with the woodsmen who are cutting my trees. They have complaints. I go play some cards where, with these lice, these ne'er-do-well men, we're squabbling over pennies. I've just got this totally degraded, rundown life. But when I go home and I read the words of Plutarch and of Julius Caesar and of Cicero, I feel like I am entering the courts of some of the greatest men to have ever lived. And I get to enter their presence, and out of their kindness, I'm learning their wisdom. And it's just this amazing description to me. I hope that is what you feel listening to How to Take Over the World. That's what I try to create, at least. In fact, How to Take Over the World is, in many ways, just like a podcast version of The Prince. That's what The Prince is. He's giving all these lessons, but mostly he's giving them in the context of the lives of these great men who have lived and conquered and died. So we'll get to what is actually contained in The Prince in just a minute. We'll go through his playbook for taking over the world. But first, I just want to go through the rest of his life kind of very quickly, because there's not as much drama in the rest of his life. So he writes The Prince in these evening hours while he's sort of in domestic exile. And he takes it to Lorenzo de' Medici, who is the Medici who's in power at the time. Lorenzo was kind of pig-headed. He didn't have a great appreciation of literature or of art. He was far from the most capable Medici. This is not Lorenzo the Magnificent, who you might have heard of. That's the most famous Medici. Also Lorenzo de' Medici, but this is his grandson. And he's not the greatest guy. But in all likelihood, Lorenzo de' Medici never even reads The Prince. If he does, he doesn't highly regard it, and Machiavelli never gets any sort of appointment from him. So he just continues to scratch out a meager living on his small estate, and he stays active in Florentine literary circles. He writes his next two most famous works, which are Discourses on Livy and The Art of War. He also writes a little poetry. He writes a play, which is actually very well received. It's one of the great Italian plays of all time. It's a big hit. But neither Discourses on Livy nor The Prince were actually published during his lifetime because of their controversial nature. The Prince explains how to take and maintain power as a monarch, as a prince. And it's extremely clear-eyed about what is necessary to do this. Of course, as we said, it recommends deception, dissimulation, violence, including against innocents. It's very critical of the Catholic Church. It definitely would have been regarded as morally objectionable by many people, and in fact was regarded as such after his death. So that's why he didn't publish it in his lifetime. He writes it, he tries to give it to Lorenzo de' Medici. It's not accepted, and so he just shelves it, and he doesn't publish it. Discourses on Livy, same thing. He writes it, this time not for the Medicis, but for his literary circle, for his friends, and as a study, just as something that he was very interested in. It's a commentary on the writings of Titus Livius, commonly known as Livy, who's a Roman historian writing during the time of Caesar Augustus. And Machiavelli was absolutely obsessed with Rome. He was obsessed, especially with the Roman Republic. He thought it was the ideal form of government, the ideal state. And Discourses on Livy discusses what it was about the Roman Republic that made it so successful and how a return to that Roman golden age could be achieved. And so This kind of book is dangerous for a few reasons. One, he clearly criticizes in both The Prince and Discourses on Livy the morality of his own time. He viewed the Catholic Church as a corrupting force, especially on Italy. He thought the church kept Italy weak and divided, and he wanted to see a return to the manly virtue of the Romans. So this is basically Nietzsche 300 years before Nietzsche. Here's just one passage Machiavelli writes in Discourses on Livy about this. Quote, "In considering, therefore, why all the people of ancient times were greater lovers of liberty than those of our own day, I believe this arises from the same cause that today makes men less strong, which I believe lies in the difference between our education and that of antiquity, based upon the difference between our religion and that of antiquity. For while our religion has shown us truth and the true path, it also makes us place a lower value on worldly honor, whereas the pagans, who greatly valued honor and considered it the highest good, were more ferocious in their actions. This can be seen in many of their customs, beginning with the magnificence of their sacrifices as compared to the modesty of our own, in which there is some pomp that is more delicate than magnificent, but no bold or ferocious action. Besides this, ancient religion praised only men fully possessed of worldly glory, such as the leaders of armies and the rulers of republics. Our religion has more often glorified humble and contemplative men rather than active ones." Okay, so, very clearly, this would have been outrageous at the time. He is praising pagan morality, old, warrior morality, and he's criticizing Catholic Christian morality. So yes, this would have been not only controversial, but dangerous to him if he had published it during his life. It's also dangerous to the Medicis and to many other princes and kings who might feel threatened by his critiques of monarchical forms of government and his support, full-throated support for republics. The only book that is published during his lifetime is The Art of War, kind of like The Prince, but more narrowly focused on exactly what it sounds like, on how to win a war. And as such, it's not so controversial. So those three works are published in the 7 years after he's in government. Okay, so during his time of internal exile. So here's the timeline. From 1498 to 1512, so that is 14 years, he is in power. So that's from age 29 to age 43, it would be. And then from 1512 to 1519, he is in internal exile on his estate, and he writes all of his major works. He writes The Prince, he writes Discourses on Livy, he writes The Art of War. So that is from age 43 to 50. And then in 1519, Lorenzo de' Medici dies. So it's 7 years totally out in the cold. But then Lorenzo Medici dies, and that was really Machiavelli's chief antagonist. So the Medici stay in power, just not that Medici. And so when that happens, the government thaws a little bit. It warms to the idea of Machiavelli. So he doesn't get put in power like he was before. Again, in that first time period from 1498 to 1512, he's in very important government positions. He's one of the top ministers in the government. But after 1519, he does get some minor appointments from the Medicis, and with that, a little bit of money, a little bit of income. He also, during this latter period, he writes a history of Florence, which is very well received at the time, very appreciated. And then in 1527, the Medici are expelled once again. And so this is a great opportunity for Machiavelli. However, in the same year, he dies from a stomach ailment at the age of 58. Okay, so that is the life of Niccolo Machiavelli. Okay, so having said all that, what can we learn from The Prince, from Discourses on Livy? What is the Machiavelli blueprint for taking over the world? One, the first thing to say is Machiavelli is often viewed as a man who was all about the pure pursuit of power. He had no higher ideals. He recommended none. The ends always justify the means, will to power, all of that. And that's not correct. He really believed in republics. He really believed in the idea of resurrecting Rome. For 2,000 years, up to the current day, to now, 2025, whenever European states have achieved great things, it has been because they looked back to the example of eternal Rome. So that's, the Holy Roman Empire under Charlemagne. That is the Renaissance with Da Vinci and Copernicus and all these great scientists and artists. They all looked back to Roman engineers, scientists, artists. That goes for the Napoleonic Empire, was totally inspired by Rome. The British Empire, and of course, the United States of America was basically just trying to get back to the Roman ideal of government. They were all directly inspired by the example of Rome. And that is what Machiavelli believed in, the resurrection of the Roman ideal. In the introduction to the Oxford World Classics edition of Discourses on Livy, the author writes, quote, "In an age when political absolutism was increasingly the norm, Machiavelli's Republican theories would become a dangerous ideology until they were revived abroad in England and America during subsequent periods of Republican sentiment." They also quote Petrarch, who's a medieval historian, and Petrarch says, I love this quote, "What else then is all history if not the praise of Rome?" Okay, I believe that. That is what all history boils down to, the praise of Rome. And in writing The Prince, he had this in mind, as well as a certain immediate political project, which was, he was sort of a proto-Italian nationalist, okay? He wanted to unify Italy into a powerful state that could stand up to the Spanish, the Germans, the French, and the papacy. They could repel all these foreign invaders and establish an independent, strong Italy established on the Roman model, a republic. And the Medici, who he dedicated The Prince to, were ideally positioned to do this because they controlled Florence as well as the papacy at the same time. So they had money, they had influence, they had arms, at least in some measure. So they have all this stuff that they could combine to carry out this project. And so yes, he was a Republican, but he thought, well, but if I can convince the Medicis to do this, then that's worth having a monarchy for a little while, to cleanse Italy and set up this new political project. Actually, at the end of The Prince, he exhorts Lorenzo de' Medici, "One should not therefore allow this occasion to pass for Italy after so long a time to find her redeemer, nor can I express with what affection he would be received in all those provinces which have suffered from the floods of these foreign invasions, with what thirst for revenge, what unshakable fidelity, what piety, what tears. What gates would be shut against him? What peoples would refuse him obedience? What jealousy would oppose him? What Italian would deny him respect? This barbarian rule stinks in everyone's nostrils." All right, I think that's a great call to arms. And so this is what he wants the Medicis to do. He also writes at the end of The Art of War, "For this province seems born to revive dead things, as we have seen in poetry, painting, and sculpture." Okay, so the Medicis, you can throw out these invaders. This barbarian rule stinks in everyone's nostrils. Revive dead things, bring back Rome. You can do it. And so that's his project. Of course, it's not carried out because A, the Medicis don't listen to him, and then this powerful moment for the Medicis does not last. When the Pope dies, the next Pope is not a Medici, and so the moment is gone. Okay, so that's the first thing about Machiavelli, is he has a project in mind. Okay, he's not just this naked, this is a handbook for anyone to pursue power. Like, no, he hopes that this will enable certain people to do certain things. But what should you do? What's his more general advice? What is the first step on the Machiavellian path to taking over the world? First, we need a goal, and what should that goal be? He writes, "Among all men who are praised, the most highly praised are those who have been leaders and founders of religions." Okay, so we'll set that aside for now, because he doesn't discuss this or have interesting things to say about it, but he thinks those are the people who are most praised. Close afterwards, he says, come those who have founded either republics or kingdoms. After them, the most celebrated men are those who, placed at the head of armies, have enlarged either their own realm or that of their native country. To these may be added men of letters, who being of many types are each celebrated according to his level of accomplishment. To other men, infinite in number, some portion of praise may be attributed on the basis of their profession or its practice. Okay? So that is what Machiavelli is after. That is what he urges us toward. First and foremost, if you want glory in this life, the greatest thing you can do is founding a republic or a kingdom, or in other words, establishing a new political order, a new political entity. Although he also mentions, of course, great writers, thinkers, great artists, scientists, inventors get included in that. And then after that, anyone who is a great professional in their business. Okay, so how do we do that? And then it gets a little tough to answer because Machiavelli has branching chains of advice depending on Are you a new prince? Are you a hereditary prince? Are you in a republic? Or are you in a monarchy? All this stuff. And there's just a lot of different categories. So I'm just going to take my top 10 takeaways from Machiavelli. He gives great advice, much of it timeless. And so I'm going to have a really long endnote section where I go through a lot of that. But these are just 10 of my top takeaways from Machiavelli of what you should do to get power. Okay. So number 1, be bad. Okay. From The Prince, he writes, "For there is such a distance between how one lives and how one ought to live that anyone who abandons what is done for what ought to be done achieves his downfall rather than his preservation. A man who wishes to profess goodness at all times will come to ruin among so many who are not good. Therefore, it is necessary for a prince who wishes to maintain himself to learn how not to be good and to use this knowledge or not to use it according to necessity." Okay. So yeah, like he's telling you straight up, if you want to have power, there are going to be times when you have to do things that are bad. Okay. It just is what it is. And if you're going to be bad, be bad. In The Prince again, he writes, "With very few exceptions of cruelty, he will prove more compassionate than those who, out of an excessive mercy, permit disorders to continue from which arise murders and plundering. For these usually injure the entire community, while the executions ordered by the prince injure specific individuals." So in other words, if you want to be a prince, if you want to take control, it's better to go out and just lop off a few heads, end all the dissent, end all the rebellions, and have a peaceful kingdom than allow all this stuff to continue and, lots of people get murdered and plundered by these fractious civil wars and rebellions and things like that. Okay, so lesson number 1, you have to learn to be bad in some ways. Okay, lesson number 2 is the necessary corollary, which is yes, but don't appear to be bad. Okay, so he says, "It would be a very praiseworthy thing to find in a prince those qualities mentioned above that are held to be good." Okay, so it'd be good to find a prince who's all good. But since it is neither possible to have them nor to observe them all completely, so in other words, since I just told you, you're going to have to be bad sometimes, because the human condition does not permit it, a prince must be prudent enough to know how to escape the infamy of those vices that would take the state away from him, and be on guard against those vices that will not take it from him whenever possible. But if he cannot, he need not concern himself unduly if he ignores these less serious vices. Moreover, he need not worry about incurring the infamy of those vices without which it would be difficult to save the state, because carefully taking everything into account, he will discover that something which appears to be a virtue, if pursued, will result in his ruin, while some other things which seem to be a vice, if pursued, will secure his safety and his well-being. So in other words, sometimes you just have to be bad, and everyone knows you're bad. And you know what? Them's the breaks, as they say. That's how it goes. But other times, you have to act bad, but appear to be virtuous. Okay, people cannot know or perceive the things that you do that are bad. A great example of this that he gives is Borgia. So when he needs to just totally be bad, repress Romagna, this region in Rome, in Italy, I should say, he has someone else do it, and he swoops in at the end and goes, "I can't believe the things you've been doing," and has him executed. Okay, that's a perfect example of doing bad, but not appearing bad. So there you go. Step 1, be bad. Step 2, don't appear to be bad. Okay, and then step 3, and this is the last one kind of on this theme, is be totally bad all at once. Okay, he has a chapter in Discourses on Livy with an all-time great chapter title. It's titled, "Men Very Rarely Know How to Be Entirely Good or Entirely Bad." And he basically says, you got to choose. You got to do one or the other. If you're going to be bad, and be bad all at once. He gives an example of a man named Giovanpogolo, okay, who was a known sinner, had a reputation for all sorts of licentiousness and exploitation, and during one of his invasions, he captures the Pope who opposed him, okay? Huge prize, and this guy has been his intractable enemy. And rather than executing the Pope or throwing him into prison or exiling him, he caves at the last minute and allows the Pope to remain and loses everything. He says this was the wrong thing to do. You should have just killed the Pope. If you're going to be bad, be totally bad all at once. This is why Discourses on Livy was not published during his lifetime. Okay, you can imagine how people would have received this advice. So be bad all at once. He also writes in The Prince, Those cruelties are well used, if it is permitted to speak well of evil, that are carried out in a single stroke, done out of necessity to protect oneself, and then are not continued, but are instead converted into the greatest possible benefits for the subjects. Those cruelties are badly used that, although few at the outset, increase with the passing of time instead of disappearing. Those who follow the first method can remedy their standing both with God and with men. The others cannot possibly maintain their positions. Okay. So in other words, do all your evil up front, execute everyone you have to do, be really harsh, because then he says you can remedy your situation with God even. You can repent later if you need to, and you can remedy your standing with the community. But if you're weak at front and then you have to keep doing these small little injustices, people aren't going to like you. That's very bad. Okay, so advice from Machiavelli: do your atrocities the right way, folks. You can quote me on that. But I think in a business context, that means, look, if you need to come in and you need to cut some spending and you need to fire some people and you do some things that aren't nice, do it all up front. Do it all at once. Cut deep. Don't, fire some people and then 6 months later, oh, we need more cutbacks, fire some more people. Don't draw it out. If there's tough stuff to be done, do it all at once and do it at the beginning. Okay. Number 4, be self-reliant. He constantly talks about the need for your own arms and not mercenaries, something derived, of course, from experience in his own life. And there's probably a lesson there about contractors and outsourcing, right, in a business context. Princes can't outsource military, and you can't outsource your key function, because military, war is the key responsibility of a prince during this time. So he writes in The Prince, "Therefore, a prince must not have any other object, nor any other thought, nor must he adopt anything as his art, but war, its institutions, and its discipline, because that is the only art befitting one who commands. This discipline is of such efficacy that not only does it maintain those who were born princes, but it enables men of private station on many occasions to rise to that position. On the other hand, it is evident that when princes have given more thought to delicate refinements than to military concerns, they have lost their state. The most important reason why you lose is by neglecting this art, while the way to acquire it is to be well versed in this art." Okay. I have like 1,000 quotes here about mercenaries. I'll just share this one. "In peacetime, you are plundered by them. In war, by your enemies. The reason for this is that they have no other love nor other motive to keep them in the field than a meager salary, which is not enough to make them want to die for you. They love being your soldiers when you are not waging war, but when war comes, they either flee or desert. This would require little effort to demonstrate, since the present ruin of Italy is caused by nothing other than its having relied on mercenary troops for a period of many years. Those kinds of soldiers, therefore, come only slow, tardy, and weak conquests, but sudden and astonishing losses." Okay, so you need your key function to be your employees. You need actual oversight over them. You can't outsource it. Can't get contractors. And then you need them to not be mercenaries, even when they're your employees. They have to actually believe in the cause. Otherwise, with people who don't really believe in what you're doing, slow, tardy, and weak conquests, as he says, and sudden and astonishing losses. Okay. Number 5, reward, merit, and initiative. Okay, this is a great one. From Discourses on Livy. "The Romans, as we explained above, were not only less grateful than other republics, but also more compassionate and respectful in the punishments of their army commanders than any other republic. Even if a commander's errors were committed out of malice, they punished him humanely. And if it was committed out of ignorance, they not only avoided punishing him, but they rewarded and honored him." Okay, so in other words, what he's saying is, if a Roman commander just messed up, the Romans didn't care. They didn't punish him. They certainly didn't punish him severely. And he goes on to say that unhindered by irrelevant matters in making decisions, they did not wish to add to something already difficult and dangerous in itself, new difficulties and dangers, believing that if they did so, no commander would ever be able to take skillful action. In other words, if I have to worry not only about fighting a war, but I have to worry about how I'm perceived, am I going to be punished when I go home, then you're not going to be able to fight effectively. And so the Roman commanders didn't have to worry about that. The British Navy actually took it even further. So the one admiral that the British executed, his name was Admiral John Byng. And this is the height of the British Empire, right? This is the Navy that took over the world. And in that British Navy, the one thing you could be executed for, and this is the thing that Admiral Byng was executed for, was failing to engage the enemy. Failure in a daring enterprise, a raid, an attack that goes wrong, that was tolerated and, like the Romans, even at times celebrated. Oh, you didn't pull it off, but what a heroic attempt. But a failure of initiative, a failure to try, that could get you executed. Okay. And on this note, like, of course, you want people in your organization, as I just said, who believe in it, who believe in your company, in your country, whatever. But Machiavelli tells us that it's not a bad thing to have men who are in it for their own benefit. He has a chapter titled, "Those who fight for their own glory are good and faithful soldiers." Okay. So you really want to reward merit and reward daring so that you have people who want to do it for their own sake. They know they're going to be rewarded, they're going to be recognized, they're going to get glory for doing something big and audacious. Okay, takeaway number 6 is all-out effort all at once. Machiavelli is always encouraging going all the way, whether that is in committing evil, as we already established, or in carrying out a war or throwing a revolution. He always wants to do it all the way or not at all. He says the middle path is the one that always ends in disaster. And so if you remember in the Isaac Newton episode, I talked about how one great sprint can change your life, working your guts out for just one condensed period of time. It gives you lift and helps you break through barriers that you otherwise can't get through when you're just working kind of slow and steady. And the same is true on an organizational level as well. Machiavelli talks about this in the context of Romans and how they conducted war. Okay, so we read in the Discourses on Livy, anyone who desires to do all these things must follow the Roman style and method. This was, first of all, to make wars short and massive. I love that description, short and massive, as the French say, because by fielding enormous armies, the Romans brought to a very swift conclusion all the wars that they waged against the Latins, the Samnites, and the Etruscans. If we take note of all those wars they fought from the beginning of Rome until the siege of Veii, we shall see that all of them were expedited, some in 6 days, others in 10, and still others in 20 days. Thus as was their custom. As soon as war was declared, they marched forth against the enemy with their armies and immediately waged a decisive battle. So, even if you're not a general, when you spot an opportunity or a threat, you want to devote all your resources that you can across your entire organization in every function and solve that problem as quickly as possible. Elon Musk is a great example of this. If you go read about, he does this both at SpaceX and at Tesla, but the first one that comes to mind is at Tesla when they just weren't manufacturing enough cars. The manufacturing process was broken. That was the big bottleneck. And so he puts the entire team on figuring out this manufacturing process. And it became an imperative across the entire organization. Everyone was helping. And so I think this is a good metaphor for many organizations and many problems. Short, massive wars that consume all of your attention and quickly solve the problem. I'll sum it up with this quote from Machiavelli about the opposite course of action. He says, "The Romans always avoided a middle course of action and turned to extreme measures. Weak states are always ambiguous in their decisions, and slow decisions are always harmful." Okay, I like that. That is a good decision framework. Can your decision be described as extreme? Okay, the Romans always avoided a middle course of action and turned to extreme measures. Can your decision be described as extreme? If not, you might want to go back and rethink it. All right, number 7, have a bias toward moving quickly. The fastest course of action is usually the best one. Writing again of the Roman style of warfare, Machiavelli says, since all Romans were dedicated to war, they always waged it with every advantage, both with respect to expenses and with respect to every other thing. This gave rise to the fact that they avoided taking towns by siege, because they thought that this method involved far more expense and inconvenience than the benefit they could derive from the acquisition. For this reason, they believed that it was better and more useful to subjugate cities by any other means than by laying siege to them. He goes on to describe the ways they do it. They could do it by usually all-out assaults or great feats of engineering. They would build these ramparts. And it's true, you're always hearing these stories about the Romans that they never just besiege anyone. They always build these like crazy Rube Goldberg machines in order to take towns. You hear about Julius Caesar in Gaul, and he's building these giant ramps and these walls and other walls. And so, and the main reason is they just didn't want anything to slow them down. And so you want to have a bias towards ridiculous actions rather than slowing down. Again, this is something that makes me think of Elon Musk, the way he transports his rockets from Texas to Florida. I just mentioned this on another episode, but moving the rockets was going to take a long time, the way that everyone else moves their rockets, which is by barge on sea. He just said it's going to take too long. And so they decided to drive them from Texas to Florida. The rockets are far too big to fit under overpasses, so they found out the world's most circuitous route that goes on all back roads, so they don't have to go under any underpasses because the rockets are so big. And they're driving 10 miles an hour the entire time. They drive through the whole night, but it's a little bit faster than shipping them by barge, and so that's what SpaceX does. So anyways, this is an example of kind of the Roman style. Rather than wait, we will go to wild lengths to make sure that we can just move quickly. So always have that bias towards doing the fastest thing, even if it requires massive effort and massive action. Number 8, never let your enemies linger. Okay, so he writes in The Prince, accordingly, with respect to the first example, every prince should be warned that he will never live in security in his principality as long as those whom he deprived of it are alive. With respect to the second example, every powerful man should be reminded that old injuries are never canceled by new benefits, and this is even less likely when the new benefit is less important than the old injury. Okay, this is a mistake a lot of people make, is they think, all right, I hurt this person, maybe I'm coming in as CEO and this person thought he was going to get the promotion to CEO, and this is embarrassing for him, but I'll keep him around and we'll patch it up and make it work. And Machiavelli's viewpoint is no, that never works. He actually uses the phrase wipe out, at least this is the way it's translated in my edition of The Prince. And so he says, you either need to wipe out your enemies or leave them alone. Again, no middle course. There's a caveat to this, which is people who oppose you, you don't necessarily inflict any harm on them, but they oppose you because they think they have something to lose from you coming to power. So this could be the VP. You didn't do anything to him. He never thought he was going to be the CEO, but he was opposed to you being CEO because he thought that was going to hurt him somehow. Those kind of people can become valuable allies because they work really hard to stay in your good graces because they thought they had something to lose. So he differentiates between people who opposed you and people to whom you have done actual harm. People to whom you've actually done harm, you can't hurt someone and let them linger around. You got to totally wipe them out. Fire them, get them out of your organization, get as far away from them as possible. People who merely opposed you, they can often turn and become allies. Okay. Number 9, you can be feared or loved, but never hated. So he writes in Discourses on Livy, besides this, men are driven by 2 principal impulses, either by love or by fear, so that anyone who makes himself loved can command them just as easily as anyone who makes himself feared. On the contrary, anyone who makes himself feared is in most cases more readily followed and obeyed than anyone who makes himself loved. It matters very little, therefore, which of these 2 paths a commander takes, as long as he is an extremely able man, and this exceptional ability makes him esteemed among men. Then he writes in The Prince, kind of going on the same theme, from this arises an argument whether it's better to be loved than to be feared. On the contrary, the answer is that one would like to be both than one or the other. But since it is difficult to be both together, it is much safer to be feared than to be loved. When one of the 2 must be lacking, for one can generally say this about men: they are ungrateful, fickle, simulators and deceivers, avoiders of danger, and greedy for gain. Okay? So if you can be loved and feared, difficult, not impossible. But he kind of says, as long as you're talented, either one is fine, but feared is safer than loved. However, he goes on, a prince must nevertheless make himself feared in such a way that he will avoid hatred, even if he does not acquire love, since one can very easily be feared and yet not hated. And above all things, a prince must guard himself against being despised and hated. Okay? And he actually, this is a good point too. He goes on to point out, quote, here one must note that hatred is acquired just as much through good actions as by sorry ones. So in other words, well-meaning but weak actions can also make you hated. So you've got to watch out for that as well. Just having good intentions doesn't mean that you won't be hated. So I really like that you should try to be both loved and feared, but default towards making sure that people fear you. And that's true not just in warfare and politics, but in business. I mean, you look at some of these great business leaders, Edison, Steve Jobs, like these people were feared in a certain way, but never be hated. If you're capricious, if you are arbitrary, if you're vindictive, you're doing these things that really make people hate you. You want them to fear you because they know they have to be on their game when they're around you, because you know yours and you're about performance and you're pushing people forward. That's the kind of fear you want to instill, not the kind of fear that is arbitrary and just makes people dislike you for the sake of it and hate you. So it's a good lesson. Loved, okay. Feared, necessary, but never hated. Okay. And my 10th lesson, and perhaps the most important one, continue listening to How to Take Over the World. Okay. Because these are the kind of stories that Machiavelli loved. He writes in The Prince, "But as for study, the prince must read histories and in them consider the deeds of excellent men. He must see how they conducted themselves in wars. He must examine the reasons for their victories and for their defeats, in order to avoid the latter and to imitate the former. Above all else, he must do as some eminent men before him have done, who elected to imitate someone else who had been praised and honored before them, and always keep in mind his deeds and actions. Just as it is reported that Alexander the Great imitated Achilles, Caesar imitated Alexander, and Scipio imitated Cyrus." Okay? It's like the whole thesis of this podcast is that you can just look at the lives of the great people who came before you and copy them 100%. Not enough people do this. They think they have to be some original in some way. Originality will come to you, but you can just copy a playbook of a great person. If you're a founder, an entrepreneur, just copy the playbook of a great founder, entrepreneur. If you want to be a politician, just do exactly what someone else before you did. And that's exactly what he's saying. Study these lives. It's the most important thing that you can study. That's why I do this podcast. I don't think anything is more important. That's why things like Plutarch's Lives have been the Bible of some of the greatest leaders of all of history for thousands of years now. Again, he writes in The Prince. And I like this because it can feel a little ridiculous sometimes studying these people who are so great. Like, okay, am I going to copy the playbook of Julius Caesar, of Genghis Khan, of Alexander the Great? But here's what Machiavelli has to say about it and why he thinks we should study those stories. He says, "No one should wonder if, in speaking of principalities that are completely new as to their ruler and form of government, I cite the greatest examples. Since men almost always follow the paths trod by others and proceed in their affairs by imitation, although they are not fully able to stay on the path of others, nor to equal the virtue of those they imitate, a wise man should always enter those paths trodden by great men and imitate those who have been most excellent, so that if one's virtue does not match theirs, at least it will have the smell of it. He should do as those prudent archers do, who, aware of the strength of their bow when the target at which they are aiming seems too distant, set their sights much higher than the designated target, not in order to reach such a height with their arrow, but instead to be able, by aiming so high, to strike their target." Okay, so in other words, okay, you're probably not going to end up Julius Caesar, but if you aim for Julius Caesar, then you'll, do as well as you can do, right? It's okay to set your expectations unrealistic. Shoot for the moon, you might catch a star, whatever they say. And then the last one on this point is a quote from the introduction to The Prince when he is writing directly to Lorenzo de' Medici. He says, "In most instances, it is customary for those who desire to win the favor of a prince to present themselves to him along with those things which they value most, or which they feel will most please him. Thus we often see princes given horses, arms, and vestments of gold cloth, precious stones, and similar ornaments suited to their greatness. Wishing, therefore, to offer myself to your magnificence with some evidence of my devotion to you, I have not found among my belongings anything that I might value more or prize so much as the knowledge of the deeds of great men that I have learned from a long experience in modern affairs and a continuous study of antiquity." And so that's why not only should you listen to How to Take Over the World, you should listen to founders, you should listen to Cost of Glory, you should read Plutarch, you should read these biographies of the people that are most interesting to you, because this is the most valuable thing that I can offer you, and one of the most valuable things in the world are these stories. Machiavelli was right. They do have the power to transform your life and catapult you forward. He really believed that. I really believe that. Okay, so there you go. Those were my top takeaways from Discourses on Livy, from The Prince. Now let's talk about Machiavelli as a movement leader, how he actually took over the world. And there is a case to be made that he did, because he was essentially a proto-nationalist. He advocated for a supreme state to which the church was subservient and not the other way around. He advocated for a return to Roman militaristic virtue. He advocated for nations that could rely on their own armed men rather than on mercenaries. In a nutshell, he advocated for the modern political world. And wouldn't you know, I mean, that's obviously what we got. Of course, now when I say modern, I don't actually mean contemporary. I don't mean current, because we do live in a post-national moment. So if you're going to say that Machiavelli was the initial inspiration for modernity, you're really talking about the late 1700s up until 1945. That's kind of the world that Machiavelli created. And his apotheosis was arguably achieved through the person of Napoleon Bonaparte, who also loved Rome, was obsessed with it in much the same way that Machiavelli was. In fact, he was obsessed in particular with Julius Caesar. The first political entity that was set up by Napoleon was when he conquered Italy, and he sets up something called the Cisalpine Republic, which he called that because Caesar's first proconsular province was Cisalpine Gaul. Cisalpine Gaul, Cisalpine Republic. Okay, so he's trying to copy Julius Caesar. He then invades Egypt, just as Caesar did, takes a mistress and sails down the Nile with her, as Caesar did, goes back and declares himself consul like Caesar, adopts the imperial eagle, becomes emperor, dismisses his first wife just like Caesar did. I mean, he's copying Caesar every step of the way. In fact, most people don't know this. The last thing Napoleon was doing on the island of St. Helena when he died was he was writing a commentary on Caesar's campaigns. Okay. So like Machiavelli, Napoleon is obsessed with Rome. He embodies the old manly Roman virtues. Like Machiavelli, he's also Italian. He's conquest-oriented. He makes the Catholic Church subservient to the state in France, just as Machiavelli recommends. He uses many of Machiavelli's tactics in his conquests. So, yeah, like Napoleon represents the world that Machiavelli imagined. Now, I should mention that while Napoleon definitely read Machiavelli and admitted as much, he never publicly claimed Machiavelli as an influence, because that would have been political suicide, right? People already suspected him of being rapacious, of, being too focused on conquest, of lying and causing unnecessary bloodshed, a warmonger, right? So Napoleon never admits that he's influenced by Machiavelli. There are some who are close to him, though, that said that Napoleon admitted to them that he was his favorite writer. That may or may not be true, because it's unclear. These are people who were close to Napoleon and then eventually turned on him, and it's unclear to me. Maybe they were just trying to slander Napoleon by saying that he was obsessed with Machiavelli, read him obsessively, and tried to follow all of his tactics. But whether it is directly the influence from Machiavelli to Napoleon, or whether it kind of came through his intellectual tradition, the influence is definitely there. So how does Machiavelli establish this school of thought that comes to be so influential that it kind of establishes the modern world? Well, let's say that you wanted to start a political or philosophical movement that outlives you, that inspires the future, that brings something around. What would you do? What can we learn from this? Number one, be exciting, be edgy. There are actually times when Machiavelli calls out princes for being too evil, too bad, doing things that are beyond the pale, too much. And so, he doesn't have to include these sentences that say, be bad. It's okay to lie and dissimulate. It's okay to deceive. It's okay to wipe out the bloodline of opponents. There could have been softer and more acceptable ways to say many of the things that he said. He is obviously, to me, courting controversy. He wants the writing to be edgy and to make you feel uncomfortable, because that's what makes it exciting. That's what makes it feel taboo. And all of a sudden you're like, whoa, you're looking around like, I can't believe I'm reading this. And it's exciting, and therefore you want to share it, and it makes it go viral. It reminds me of Curtis Yarvin, America's leading monarchist. Okay. And he calls himself America's leading monarchist. And he kind of has, and so he's been very, very influential. And he has kind of two ways of talking about his philosophy. So Curtis Yarvin, someone alive right now, has been writing for the last 20 years, and he thinks that America needs more monarchy. That it was a big mistake for America to become a democratic republic, and monarchy actually is what works. It's what works for every Fortune 500 company, and it would work for America, for any country. Monarchy is the best system of government. I'm not saying I agree with this. This is Curtis Yarvin's philosophy. And you hear him talk about it in two ways. In one, or three ways. Monarchy is kind of the standard moniker. Sometimes he will come out and say, America needs a dictatorship. That's what we're talking about here, a radical dictatorship. Then other times, like he's getting interviewed by the New York Times, and he says, look, all I mean by this is America needs a national CEO, okay? Someone who's fully in charge of the government. That can be a president. It doesn't have to be a hereditary monarch. We need a president right now who's president in the same way that Abraham Lincoln was, and George Washington, and FDR. Okay, these were people who were fully in charge of the American government. That's what we need today. Okay, that sounds way less scary, right? So, and look, you can see how it's not like he has to be lying either way. He can be talking about the same thing. This is just two different ways of portraying it. One public facing, one private facing. But my contention is, if Curtis Yarvin only spoke about a national CEO in this more family-friendly, PR speak, oh, we just need a national CEO, isn't this nice? This is non-threatening. Then his movement never would have got off the ground. And by the way, it is ascendant right now. It's called neo-reaction is what he calls his movement. And J.D. Vance is obviously a fan of Curtis Yarvin, as well as I'd be shocked if Elon Musk hasn't read Curtis Yarvin. Everyone in Silicon Valley has read him. Mark Andreessen, Peter Thiel. Like his philosophy has, in a very short amount of time, gained an incredible amount of influence. And it's because of this, because you read it and you're looking around like, oh, is anyone else reading this over my shoulder? I can't believe I'm reading this. And that makes it exciting. It makes it viral, makes it shareable. And that's what Machiavelli is doing. He is intentionally, making his work as controversial as possible. That's what Jesus did as well, by the way. His ideas were often expressed in the most in-your-face, controversial way possible. The first shall be last, the last shall be first. If any man come to me and hate not his father and mother and wife and children and brethren and sister, yea, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. That's a quote from Jesus. Is there a better way to say that if you want to be unthreatening? Yes, of course. Jesus could have said, look, you need to leave everything behind and follow me. All right, it's saying the same thing, but it doesn't sound nearly as scary. But he's saying, no, you have to leave your mother and your father. You have to hate them. You have to hate yourself and come follow me. Clearly, he's trying to be provocative. And the message that's provocative is the reason that Christianity took over the world. Okay. So there you go. Number one, be exciting, be taboo, be Jesus, be Machiavelli, be Marx, be Curtis Yarvin, be controversial. Number two, be succinct. Discourses on Livy is really good. In some ways, it's better than The Prince, in some ways. But The Prince is the more famous of Machiavelli's works, in part because it is so short and easy to read. It's really easy to grasp. It's very memorable. And it's okay to have larger explanations in the background for people who want to learn more, but you need to give people something short, punchy, and memorable that they can latch onto and share. You can think of this like Karl Marx, another great movement leader. Whatever you think of what's come of his movement, or even how it started. But he has Das Kapital, which is dense and difficult to read and no one reads it. But he's got the Communist Manifesto. And that went super viral because it's very short and succinct, and it's easy to spread and digest. And so that worked for Karl Marx. It worked for Machiavelli too. A part of what makes The Prince so famous, so viral, is how short and digestible it is. And then number three, don't worry about the masses. Machiavelli didn't publish The Prince or the Discourses on Livy during his lifetime. At this point, yes, The Prince is a mainstream hit. It has sold tens of millions of copies, but only nerds like me have ever actually read it. And most of those who do read it don't understand it. And that's fine. Who cares? It took over the world without people realizing that it was doing so. Machiavelli, in his lifetime, only circulated it in the literary circles of Florence. And in some ways, I think its inaccessibility might have made it more scintillating. because you knew that this is something that appealed to people like you, people of high status, intellectuals, people who get it, right? And so you need to focus on a message, not that has the broadest appeal, but that has a strong attraction, a really strong appeal to the right people, to the influence makers, to the people who can spread it and get it into more hands. And so it's not how many people are influenced by it directly, it's how many people are influenced by it indirectly via that vanguard who gets it and keeps the message alive. Okay. So there you go. That is the framework. If you have an idea, a philosophy, a movement that you want to outlive you and go big, number one, make it controversial. Number two, give the people something that is short and punchy and digestible. And number three, get it in the hands of not the most people, but the right people, and create that subculture. You know, talking about this right now actually reminds me of the book of Revelation in the Bible. And why? Because the book of Revelation, the word in Greek is apocalypse. What's the original? Apocalypsis. Apocalypse. And apocalypse, we think the apocalypse means the end of the world, right? But apocalypse actually means revelation. It means an unveiling. Because, in the book of Revelation, in the apocalypse, the end of the world and all these hidden things are revealed to you. And I think that feeling of unveiling, that is such a powerful feeling. That is the feeling that Machiavelli gives you. You read this and you're like, whoa, the scales have fallen off my eyes. I finally understand what's going on and how these people operate and the tricks that they're playing on the world, right? And you get that same feeling that you get from like Steve Jobs' product announcement. When he does, he literally, right, he pulls back the curtain, he shows you the thing, and the whole world changes. I think that feeling, that unveiling, wow, now I see, now I understand. There's so much power in that. And I think that anyone who teaches should do that. Even teaching simple things, even teaching like middle school geometry. I mean, think about it. A couple thousand years ago, a few hundred years ago, this is a blink of an eye, cosmically speaking. To know and understand things that a middle schooler learns in geometry class would have been world-changing knowledge, right? And so, even as a middle school history, geometry, English teacher, you can create that feeling of, I am going to unveil this new, exciting truth to you, this thing that is going to set your soul on fire and excite you. And that's how you teach. And ultimately, you can't lead if you can't teach. So every teaching moment should be an apocalypse. It should excite your audience and feel that you're unveiling something very important and valuable and exciting to them. I think that is how you take over the world Machiavelli style. All right. That does it for the free version. If you're joining us for the first time on these episodes, I go through their whole life. I do my main lessons, and this is all free in the podcast on the YouTube. However, there is a premium version where I have even more takeaways. I have some endnotes, some other commentaries on the rest of their life. So, for example, in this one, I'm going to talk more about what kind of person Machiavelli was, get more into his personality, because I found him absolutely captivating, fun, interesting. And then I'll go through some takeaways, some more of the lessons that he gives in The Prince and Discourses on Livy of how to be a better leader. And then I'll also go through some end notes. And then I'll end talking more about my own dreams of continuing that project of Machiavelli's of resurrecting Rome and the Roman spirit, and what that could look like today, how we could possibly revive Rome, literally rebuild it, and kind of how it could conquer the world once again. So if you're interested in hearing all that, go subscribe at takeoverpod.supercast.com. Or if you're listening right now on Apple Podcasts, you can subscribe there. For the rest of you who are tuning out now, until next time, thank you for listening to How to Take Over the World. Oh, and before you go, this episode is brought to you by Speechify. Speechify turns anything into a podcast. I use it a ton. I used it for the research for this book. So yeah, I had an old copy of The Prince and I put it into Speechify. And so I would just listen and read at the same time on my phone through Speechify. And then every time that there was a quote I wanted to remember, I just took a screenshot and dropped that into my notes app. So it's a great way. You can get through more material. You can read faster when you read and listen at the same time while still maintaining a super high level of comprehension. Great leaders, great conquerors, great scientists, great artists, great founders. They all are obsessed with taking in more information, learning more as quickly as they can. And Speechify is just a fantastic tool for learning more, learning faster. So go to speechify.com/Ben to get a 15% discount on Speechify Premium. You won't regret it.